Plato saw the individual as a temporary union of soul and body. The soul was the senior and lasting principle, while the body, being of the earth, was destined to perish. The human being was an animal, sharing certain traits with the rest of the animal kingdom, yet unlike them in possessing a soul. The cosmos itself was also described as an animal, but unlike man it was eternal. In his writings, Plato explored the process by which soul and body were joined to form living beings. He expressed these ideas in mythological and symbolic language, borrowing what he could from the limited biological theories of his time, but reshaping them to suit the aims of philosophical instruction. Myth was for him the proper way to speak of what could not be described factually or proved by dialectical reasoning. Since the world of physical phenomena was in constant motion and change, it could never be fully explained. All that could be offered was a likely story, something persuasive but unverifiable. This use of myth was not mere inheritance from earlier thinkers who stressed the ceaseless flux of reality. At times it rose to the level of prophecy, a kind of myth that seemed to demand belief not in its details, but in its vision as a whole. From such lofty mythical constructions, Plato's account of the beginnings of the individual gradually moved toward a form of narrative that, while still mythological in tone, was increasingly infused with factual material. His description of the soul's union with the body shifted from focusing primarily on the soul to giving more attention to the body and its place in the order of living things. This development is most clearly seen in the Timaeus, the dialogue most concerned with scientific detail. There, one finds not a full biological theory, but an outline of how Plato imagined the union of soul and body. Although the soul was prior to the body, Plato still regarded it as something created. The divine craftsman who shaped the cosmos and the gods also fashioned the souls of human beings. He used the same elements from which he had made the soul of the world, sameness, otherness, and being, but now of a lesser purity, mere remnants of the original mixture. These elements were blended together in the same cosmic vessel and divided into separate souls. Each soul was assigned to a star, and equal in number to the stars themselves. Once formed, the souls were placed in chariots and taken on a journey through the heavens, where the laws of destiny were revealed to them. Only then were they embodied, all at once, in order to ensure that none received an advantage over the others. These living creatures were the most God-revering of animals, divided into two kinds, of which the stronger was man. Embodied souls, as human beings, were subject to the opposing forces of pain and pleasure that shaped mortal life. If the soul could master the passions and resist their assaults, it would return at death to its star, the one to which it had first been assigned. But if it failed to govern its desires, it would be reborn in a lesser form, perhaps as a woman or as an inferior animal, and might wander through many lives before regaining its rightful place among the stars. The idea that the soul is constructed is striking when placed beside what is said of it in other dialogues. In one place, the soul is described as not created, a primal entity, and in another it is spoken of as an incomposite being, something unlike the body, since it has no parts and therefore cannot be subject to dissolution or death. Perhaps in the Timaeus Plato had moved beyond such earlier views and came to regard the soul as a composite and created thing. Yet elsewhere, such as in the Laws, the soul is presented as a primal source of motion, something immortal and indestructible, whose end cannot even be imagined. Even in that work, however, words such as birth and becoming are applied to the soul, as is the expression to be born. At the same time, the Timaeus reveals Plato's awareness of the fragility of composite beings, for they are always exposed to external forces. A way of resolving the apparent tension between the soul as uncreated and the soul as created lies in the suggestion that when Plato speaks of creation he is not speaking literally, but presenting an account of the elements of reality under the form of a cosmogony. In this sense, when he speaks of the soul's genesis, his aim is chiefly to oppose the view of those who place body before soul, and to show instead that soul holds priority. The use of the language of time here does not mean that the soul itself is subject to time, for ordinary language cannot easily express what belongs outside of time. Days, nights, and other divisions belong to the created world, not to that living whole which stands beyond time. Time itself is a created image, a reflection of eternity. The cosmos endures without end, beyond temporal sequence. In that context, words like was and will be have no proper place. Only is can express its being. Yet Plato accepts that language cannot escape time entirely, and so he allows himself to use such terms, even when speaking of what is timeless. This is partly because human beings are thought of as children of time, growing old as time grows old with them. From this perspective, there is no contradiction in saying that what is incomposite and birthless was made at a moment that is not truly in time, nor in saying that the soul is older than all things, or that what lies beyond time is prior even to time itself. For time itself had a beginning, and what is timeless was already present when time was brought into being. Thus the soul may in such language be said to be born. The same is true of the images applied to the divine craftsman. He is described as using a mixing bowl, combining within it entities that are not material, though the myth presents them as though they were substances. Plato himself warns that such images must not be taken literally. Their purpose is to suggest that the soul has a kind of structure, even if it is not literally preformed. It is preformed at least in the sense that it exists before the body and is ready to be joined to it. Elsewhere, the soul is described as actively seeking a body in which to dwell. The joining of soul and body is described in the language of high mythology, yet Plato also offers a more detailed account of their union in mythological terms shaped by the influence of earlier thinkers. Soul and body are said to come together at the level of the seed, the procreative substance that carries life from one generation to the next. This seed is widely identified with the marrow found within the bones, especially within the skull. From this marrow arise the foundations of bones and flesh, for it is their fundamental source and origin. When the soul was bound to the body, the bonds of life were fixed within the marrow to provide roots for the race of mortal creatures. This marrow itself was compounded of the purest forms of the primary elements, fire, water, air, and earth, arranged in their most balanced proportions. Out of these, the divine craftsman formed a universal seed for every mortal race. Into this marrow he set the different types of souls, shaping its forms according to the kinds of souls they were destined to hold. He molded the portion intended to contain the divine seed into a spherical form and called it the brain, so that the vessel enclosing it would be the head. The remainder, which was to contain the mortal part of the soul, he shaped into long and rounded forms and called them marrow. From these, as from anchors, he fastened the bonds that tied soul to body, beginning his work by enclosing the brain within the protective covering of bone. In this account, marrow and seed are treated as closely related, though not in every case identical. The marrow of the head serves as a field for the divine seed, but is not itself the seed. It is a special vessel made to hold it. The marrow of the other bones, except for the vertebrae, holds the mortal aspect of the soul and provides the bonds of life, though it is not linked with reproduction. Plato shows an awareness of earlier ideas that equated marrow with soul, or soul with seed, but he reshapes these notions. He draws near to the view that the head contains the essential and immortal seed, while distinguishing the divine seed from the marrow that receives it. In this way, the old formula, marrow is seed is soul, is acknowledged but refined. The terms are no longer treated as equivalents, but only as related. By calling the seed divine, Plato makes it less physical and more fitting for the immortal aspect of the soul. This divine seed carries immortality from body to body and from one generation to the next. Still, these distinctions are not pressed consistently throughout the dialogue, and elsewhere seed and marrow are spoken of as if they were one and the same. The marrow is both liquid and particulate. It is composed of elementary triangles, which are blended together to form a panspermia. In a religious sense, this word referred to a vessel filled with every kind of seed, offered to the gods in rites of fertility. Later, it came to mean the primeval mixture of atoms, comparable to such a vessel offered in sacrifice. Both meanings suggest that when Plato used the word, he had in mind the seeds of every kind of living creature. Humanity was not seen as separate from other animals, and though the earth at first was destined to be inhabited only by humans, other forms of life would appear as generations passed. By a process of degeneration, souls, which were first incarnated in human form, would eventually migrate into the bodies of other animals. Panspermia embraces all such possibilities, for it contains seed elements corresponding to the different kinds of souls. This is a step toward the individuation of seeds themselves. If each soul is joined to a particular form of seed, then the union of soul with physical seed becomes the foundation for the growth of the individual. In this way, it foreshadows a kind of preformation, for just as the living creature is body plus soul, so too the seed is body plus soul. The preformation of the seed reflects the preformation of the soul, both involving deliberate blending and mixing. The later account of seed is thus a physical extension of the earlier account of soul. Another important passage describes the sowing of seeds in the womb. Here it is said that love and desire, the male and female sexual impulses, cause disorder if they are not satisfied. This unrest is relieved when the impulses unite the sexes, and like the plucking of fruit from heavy branches, they sow within the womb, as on a ploughed field, creatures so small that they are invisible and not yet fully formed. These are then set apart within the womb, nurtured until they grow large, and finally brought into the light of day at birth. This presents a more detailed account of generation than the earlier high myths. The roles of male and female are clearly distinguished, though both are equal in importance, each contributing seed. The use of plural subjects in the account, whether referring to instincts or to the man and woman themselves, maintains a certain balance of equality, despite the masculine tone of the dialogue as a whole. Male and female exist distinctly from the first moment of incarnation, even though men may decline into women through the cycle of rebirth. The seeds that both sexes sow together in the womb are called living creatures. The question arises, what is the nature of these creatures? Are they chaotic, wholly formless matter, or are they already shaped? The language of the account leaves this uncertain, and the ambiguity itself may be deliberate. If these beings are shapeless effusions, then embryonic development resembles an epigenetic process in which the embryo is formed step by step within the womb. If, on the other hand, they already possess some shape, then Plato's view approaches a particulate preformism, where tiny invisible seed parts correspond to the future organs of the child. According to this idea, minute seed elements would come from the various parts of the parents' bodies, the head giving rise to the head, the hand to the hand, and so on, these elements gathering in the womb to form the embryo. The fluid carrying these particles could loosely be called seed, just as a jar containing wine might itself be called wine. Whether or not this is exactly what Plato held, the passage reflects the influence of Ottomist thought, which runs throughout the dialogue. It is reasonable to suppose that Plato's thought leans strongly toward preformationism. He was among the most a priori of philosophers, and he imagined the construction of the soul in concrete and poetic terms. In his account, the seed is already preformed to some degree, since the right soul must be joined with the right substance to produce it. The living beings are scattered into the womb as a shower of individuated particles, a view parallel to the particulate nature of the panspermia described earlier. It is not likely that each of these beings can be regarded as a potential embryo in a strict sense, but each could represent at least a partially fabricated part of the future embryo. This form of particulate preformism suggests that each being resembles a prefabricated component, and the embryo is assembled in the womb through a process of separation and ordering. Under these circumstances, the part itself must possess some shape. The assembly resembles the work of a craftsman who joins together the already fashioned limbs of dolls, creating figures with movable parts. This view finds some support in the meaning of the word for a living being. Etymologically, it refers to that which is alive, but it also carries the sense of a work of art, such as a painting or sculpture. Such works of art were defined by the Greeks through clarity of outline, not by chaos of form or color. Plato was well aware of this ambiguity, and in one dialogue Socrates compares his sense of the ideal constitution to a man who has seen beautiful figures either in drawings or alive. On Greek pottery, the outlines of figures were sharply etched, and this clear boundary, known as the periphery, was so central to art that the term came to describe clarity in speech as well. Works of art were thus aligned with the logos, both requiring definition and sharpness. The living being was likewise understood as a union of soul and body, a conjunction that was temporary and fragile. Later writings would continue to describe this union, sometimes even as possessing a single shape that unites the duality of soul and body under one outline. In this way, the secondary meaning of the word as something shaped seems to have influenced its primary sense as a living creature. If the living being is said to have some kind of shape, then the description of it as not fully formed must mean more than simply unshaped. It suggests not thoroughly formed, or not shaped through and through. The verb used for shaping often means the same as its simple form, that is, to give shape to material that may not itself be shaped. Yet there are examples where the prefix indicates partial or incomplete formation. In this sense, something may have a form but not a finished one. Tadpoles, for instance, possess a shape but are not fully formed, and toads likewise were regarded as incomplete. Such creatures, belonging to the amphibia, passed through startling transformations that puzzled the ancients, who could not easily determine the point at which they reached their final form. These reflections make it reasonable to attribute some kind of shape to these beings, and therefore some degree of preformation to Plato's theory. One can sympathize with those who view him as holding a type of particulate preformism, akin to the theories of Democritus, though this influence, pervasive as it may be, is never explicitly acknowledged. If Plato accepts preformation, it is always interwoven with myth, and it is this poetic element that prevents any rigid agreement with a strictly preformist interpretation. Still, it is fair to say that Plato was aware of such theories and in some sense accepted them. The contents of these passages do not in any way support the idea that Plato discovered what we now call spermatozoa. The living beings he refers to do not arise from a single parent, but from both, and it is more plausible that they represent components of the embryonic individual rather than complete individuals. Yet Plato seems innovative in calling seeds living beings, emphasizing their vitality and suggesting that they are constituents of something recognizable. His discussion addresses one aspect of the topic by describing the creation of individual living things, the combination of souls and bodies. The narrative progresses from the high, a prioristic mythology toward increasingly biological and atomistic descriptions, moving away from the flights of the winged soul found in earlier dialogues. In this way, the account partly demythologizes itself, advancing through significant though separated stages toward an explanation of individual generation. Plato appears to regard the origin of the individual as a subtle interweaving of diverse strands of soul and body. Even in the embryonic stage, individuals are not simple but possess numerous innate characteristics. Both soul and body are complex and structured, and their union represents the fusion of one complexity with another. The earlier notion of a unitary, simple soul is left behind as Plato develops a more scientifically informed, though still incomplete, theory of soul and body. He was aware that each individual descended from a vast number of physical ancestors. His approach to generation reflects a growing recognition of the intricate nature of the individual, without abandoning his long-held view that the human being has significance. The individual, in Plato's poetic account of its earliest beginnings, is presented as a refined and intricate creation, one thereby fit to be considered a responsible agent in the world and in society. In this way, the Timaeus transforms the usual social and ethical implications of atomism, turning them inside out. In the fifth book of the Republic, certain eugenic measures are prescribed that apply to the individual at every stage, as an embryo, a newborn child, and eventually as a parent. These measures are particularly concerned with the ruling guardians. Plato stresses that for the security and stability of society, the quality of its guardians must be preserved continuously from generation to generation. The price for maintaining the excellence of the group from which the rulers are drawn is the strict application of eugenic and selective rules to the life of the individual guardian. These rules scrutinize the guardian from the very moment of conception and, in some cases, may prevent his birth. They regulate his interactions with the opposite sex and determine whether he may procreate. At this point in the Republic, Plato does not feel the need to discuss the primary attraction between the sexes in detail. Eros is presented as more inexorable and fundamental than even the axioms of geometry. His concern is how this creative force might be most effectively directed to serve the stability and quality of the guardians. Certainly, Eros is a power that cannot be left to act unchecked, for it must be regulated. In the case of domesticated animals, such regulation has produced excellent eugenic results. By analogy, if only selected specimens of humanity were allowed to procreate, the governmental quality of the guardians could be concentrated, potentially bringing the ideal polity close to realization and allowing philosophy to be enthroned. The main objective, however, is the stabilization of the group's virtues and the prevention of genetic waste. Socrates outlines the eugenic prescriptions for the guardians. Those who are excellent are to be paired with excellent females of the same class as frequently as possible, while the worst are to be mated with the worst as rarely as possible. The offspring of the excellent guardians are to be raised, while the progeny of the inferior are not. The children of inferior guardians are classified in advance as monstrous births. There is no provision for examining them as they develop to see whether they display any undesirable traits of their parents. For the purposes of these eugenic rules, the offspring of inferior guardians are grouped together with physically defective children of superior guardians and are removed to a dark and concealed place. It is clear that because their parents are deemed unsuitable members of the guardian class, these children are considered to carry an intrinsic hereditary flaw. They may not be physically monstrous in any obvious way, but socially, they are treated as monsters. Outside certain age groups considered optimal for the begetting of children, no procreation is allowed, although some liaisons for individual choice or pleasure are permitted. These individuals, however, must not produce offspring. For them to do so would constitute a serious abuse of society and its permissiveness. Society would treat such a child severely, for it would not share in the blessings sought by official prayers during the temporary procreative marriages performed at special ceremonies. Priests and priestesses ask the gods to grant the city a harvest of beneficial young creatures. A child conceived outside the terms of these prayers is regarded as conceived in darkness and dreadful lust. The same rule applies to children born within the procreative age limits if the parents have not received official blessing. Such a child is regarded as bastard, unsponsored, and unholy in relation to society. This represents a quasi-magical condemnation, where the child's circumstances of conception alone classify it among the inferior types of guardians, regardless of the parent's physical or intellectual quality. No interval is mentioned for observing the child's development to assess its actual quality. The circumstances of conception are decisive. We will now examine the treatment of children based on the condition of parentage. Children of the basest guardians are not to be reared. Children of inferior guardians are to be concealed in a dark and forbidden place. Children of superior guardians, if physically defective, are to be concealed in a dark and forbidden place. Children of guardians older or younger than the legally prescribed age for procreation are regarded as conceived in darkness and with dreadful lust. Children of guardians within the procreative age group who produce children without sanction of laws are regarded as conceived in darkness and with dreadful lust, bastard, unsponsored, and unholy in the sight of society. Children of guardians outside the procreative age group who are free to cohabit with anyone not in the supposed blood-kindred age groups, not a single embryo to be brought into the light. If such an embryo survives, no rearing is provided. Socrates adds a further point. If those past the age for procreation engage in lovemaking permitted by society and produce a child, they must understand that such a child cannot be brought into the light. If the child survives, the city will make no provision for its upbringing. The term used for upbringing likely refers both to intellectual education and physical nourishment. In allowing younger and older individuals to engage in sexual relations freely, Plato may have been aware of the comparative sterility of adolescence and the reduced fertility of women over 40, though a small percentage of conceptions could still occur. This expectation suggests that Plato may have anticipated the use of exposure as a method of controlling unwanted births, and possibly abortion, as part of the general population control measures mentioned in the laws. In considering the fate Plato envisioned for children of prohibited grades of parentage, it must be remembered that he does not explicitly recommend that they be killed. Yet his insistence on excluding them from society and making no provision for their upbringing suggests that he wished them not to exist. Socrates speaks with vehement and threatening language when expressing these rather vague recommendations. It is reasonable to suppose that these implicit threats imply Plato intended infanticide by exposure. Nevertheless, he does not have Socrates state openly and clearly that the children are to be killed. Exposure carried risks. According to legend, Oedipus was exposed by his father Laius when an oracle predicted he would kill his father. His feet were bound, but he was found by shepherds and raised as the son of King Polybos of Corinth. He survived to unwittingly kill Laius in a highway encounter, marry his mother, and ultimately become a blind, exiled wanderer who disappeared into the earth at Colonus. The attempt to kill Oedipus brought disaster, misery for Oedipus, death for Laius and Jocasta, and numerous subsequent tragedies and comedies revolve around the survival of children exposed at birth. Sometimes recognition of the child is facilitated by baubles left with them, implying the possibility of survival or return. An advantage of exposure for the exposer was that it avoided the blood guilt of murder, representing a vague and undefined end to life. Wild beasts were often assumed to be the agents of death. There is no evidence that exposure was a widespread method of birth control among the Greeks. Authors have expressed strongly divergent views on this matter. It is notable, however, that the laws of Sparta and Gortyn, which served as models for Plato's Republic, did recommend the practice. Other archaeological evidence, such as pot burials of infants, does not indicate cause of death and may simply reflect high infant mortality. Despite this lack of firm evidence, Greek legends and myths indicate that the idea of exposure was widely familiar, if not commonly practiced. Plato's lack of explicitness may reflect an inner doubt about the strictness of his eugenic proposals. He was well aware of the difficulties in maintaining the genetic quality of a group, and the prophetic style of these passages may overcompensate for that doubt. Socrates speaks with the formulaic severity and sublimity of a primeval lawgiver. The language is marked by legalistic caution and redundancy, as in the triad, bastard, unsponsored, and unholy. Children of inferior guardians are to be concealed in a dark and forbidden place, a location that is secret, obscure, and ritualistically unclean, reminiscent of the apothetai near Mount Taygetus, where Spartans reportedly exposed defective infants. The term for this place implies that it is unspeakable and forbidden, under ceremonial interdict. In the Republic, the darkness surrounding unwanted children is not only physical but also ritualistic, reflecting the language of curses appended to ancient Greek legal texts and emphasizing the severe, almost sacred nature of the prohibition. In Book 3 of the Republic, Plato addresses the question of maintaining intellectual quality within the governing group. The treatment prescribed for inferior children born to the guardians is that they should be demoted to other grades of society, while promotion of suitable individuals from other groups to the status of guardians is implied. In this book, there is none of the threatening and doom-laden language seen in the passages from Book 5. Here, quality is controlled through administrative measures, promoting or demoting individuals as appropriate. The focus in this part of the Republic is not solely on preserving the quality of one group, but on grading the entire population according to talent without causing the disintegration of the polis. Plato suggests a useful device to achieve this. The three groups, the guardians, their military assistants, and the general populace, are likened to metals: gold, silver, and bronze. Metals have different values and qualities, yet all are, in a sense, children of the earth. In the same way, men, despite their differences, are brethren. Plato does not claim this as literal truth, but presents it as a noble lie to promote social cohesion. Following this analogy, he allows for the possibility that gold children might be born to bronze parents and bronze children to gold parents. Later, in the Timaeus, Plato revisits the main themes of the Republic, not as a sequel but as a cosmic exploration of similar questions. One topic recalled is the eugenic question, and the treatment described resembles Book 3 more than Book 5. The Timaeus states that the satisfactory offspring of the guardians are to be reared, while inferior specimens are to be distributed secretly through the rest of the polis. The secrecy aligns both with the noble lie of Book 3 and the aporiton of Book 5. Book 5 stands somewhat apart because Plato generally does not endorse killing. He hesitates to state explicitly the fate of the banned children, though it is reasonably clear that exposure is intended. His hesitation reflects both Greek euphemistic tendencies regarding infanticide and his reluctance to introduce a lethal note into an otherwise constructive and optimistic work. The unwritten law of Greece also tended to oppose infanticide. In the 7th epistle, Plato affirms that no one should be killed merely to realize political ideas, contrasting with the death sentences prescribed for incorrigible skeptics in the laws. His hesitations and doubts regarding eugenic measures are expressed in the furious but indirect language of Book 5. A possible explanation for this prophetic anger lies in the animal analogy presented earlier in the book, which shapes much of the subsequent discussion. Comparison of humans with animals was influenced by the 5th century contrast between nomos and physis, between human conventions and natural realities, but this comparison has a much older pedigree, as seen in Greek animal proverbs and the Aesopian corpus, where animals represent specific human traits and serve to teach moral lessons. Later works, such as the Physiognomousai, also assessed human character through resemblances to animals. Plato adopts the Pythagorean idea that the human soul might inhabit animal bodies in other lives into his own eschatology. In the Republic, attitudes toward animals are more empirical. Observation of dogs shows that females are equally capable as males in protecting young and fighting. Their behavior is more natural than that of humans, less constrained by law or custom. Consequently, human females could also receive military training to protect children and society. Women, in short, are capable of becoming guardians. Plato does not take a direct stance in the nomos-physis debate, but maintains that what is true is found in nature. His analogy of dogs suggests that their behavior reflects natural truths. For Plato, the forms themselves were, in nature, entities more real and true than the imperfect imitations humans perceive. An extension of the animal analogy naturally appears in Book 5, where the focus is on maintaining the genetic quality of the guardians. In domestic animals, stock is purified by systematic culling and selective breeding, allowing only the best to mate with the best. Plato asks whether the same principle may not apply to men and women. This process of selection is exemplified by Glaucon, who admits to using it with his horses, dogs, and birds. The analogy had been reinforced by Spartan practice, which showed its effectiveness. Plato did not consider all Spartan institutions suitable for his ideal state, yet he could not ignore Sparta's triumph over Athens in the Peloponnesian War, seeing it as a victory of selective breeding for specialist ends over the megalomaniac amateurism of Athens. In this sense, Sparta's triumph reflected the triumph of animality. Words reflecting this animality appear in Book 5, where selective breeding and the culling of young human stock are discussed. The group of guardians is called a poimnion, a herd, and the word agile, flock or herd, is also used several times. The term sikos, a pen to contain animals, describes the nursery where children of the guardians are reared once accepted as fit to survive. The word agile was also employed by the Spartans to describe certain age groups of full citizens, the homoioi, literally peers, during their education, and another group was called bua, herd of cattle. The original animal husbandry source of these terms may have been forgotten by the Spartans, accepted unreflectively. For Plato, however, applying such terms to humans likely seemed fresh and striking. His awareness of the strongly animal flavor of Aegeal is evident in the later Politicus and in the Laws. Plato's sensitivity to words and their nuances may have led him to attribute some of the harshness required for culling livestock to the human subjects of his discussion. On a secondary level, he may have been influenced unconsciously by the austere Spartan ethos implied by these terms. Plato the poet could be carried further by the power of his images than Plato the philosopher would always have approved. He was aware of this, and in Book 5, he cannot fairly be accused of adopting a crude stockbreeder's attitude toward the defective infants of his projected state. In Book 3 and in the Timaeus, he does not employ the animal analogy and suggests no severe selection of humans. Nevertheless, individuals born into the guardian's group face tests and perils. They undergo no ordinary dokimasia, no mere formality of acceptance. The infant is examined in Spartan fashion for the potential physique of a warrior, which was all that mattered to the Spartans. Plato, however, applies a broader criterion. Children may be judged inferior not only on physical grounds, but also on the parents' misbehavior. In Book 5, no statutory interval is allowed for assessing the child's intellectual abilities. This is inevitable, as infanticide, by custom and humanitarian reasoning, had to occur within a few days of birth. Yet this absence of a waiting period is a major weakness in Book 5 and in the Republic as a whole. It overrides the suggestions of Book 3, where children lacking the qualities for guardians are demoted to other societal grades, allowing time for their talents to manifest. Related to this absence of an assessment interval in Book 5 is the prescription that children conceived outside lawful arrangements are to be condemned. It is reasonable to suppose that parents who bring about an illegitimate conception automatically classify themselves as inferior guardians by their actions. The guilt of the parents, in effect, foredooms the children. Yet even for a Greek of Plato's time, this naive view of heredity was experientially untenable, as it would have been evident that children born out of wedlock do not always turn out badly. For Plato, however, such children are marked by the stain of their sinful conception, and his state will have none of them. The notion of an inherited taint is primitivistic in the 4th century. It recalls the story of judges in Sicily, who, more than a century earlier, had dismissed Chorix the orator's plea when suing a pupil for unpaid tuition. The pupil argued that Chorix had promised to teach him to win any lawsuit, so if he lost this one, the claim for payment would be void. The judges resolved the dilemma by saying that neither party should prevail, on the principle that a bad crow lays bad eggs. Plato's attitude toward these children resembles such pre-logical crossings between law and magic. This reflects a strand of the associationist way of thinking that appears at times in Plato's works, a concentration on like upon like. In a passionate act of assimilation, Plato produced the theory of forms, which are as like as possible to themselves. In the Phaedo, he asserts that things wish to be like the forms. One manifestation of this assimilative trait is the implication that a heritable taint can originate in the circumstances of conception itself, where the child ab ovo absorbs some of its parents' antisocial character. In conclusion, the lowest class of society, that of workers and producers, is the safest class into which an individual can be born. This third class seems largely unaffected by these tests, though Book 3 notes that its more intelligent members may be enlisted as guardians, corresponding to the demotion of non-gold children of gold parents. This represents the principal risk that young life in the third class faces from society. There is no suggestion that the physically deficient in this class should be eliminated, which would seem reasonable given the arduous labor their lives will require. Plato's long career of teaching, along with all his major writings, demonstrates the importance he placed upon education, or paideia. Education was not merely a means to direct the individual toward some apprehension of truth. It was also intended to bring him to a recognition and acceptance of his function within society. The Republic can be viewed as a work primarily concerned with the educative task of shaping the individual in accordance with his innate talents and society's needs, so that he would employ these talents contentedly for the benefit of all citizens. Yet within these educational themes, certain implicit irrationalities emerge, resembling the habits of thought often described as magic thinking. These elements seem to work against the rational, often enlightened, educational policies of the Republic, particularly by impeding free movement between social classes on the basis of intellectual ability. This chapter examines the influence of such irrational elements on rational educational schemes and considers the probable effects on individuals and their development. Plato rejected the magical notion that the heavens could be bribed with sacrifices, a popular belief that presumed the gods took no account of justice or injustice, good or evil. Though ancient and time-honored, he thought such ideas must be excluded from the city of the Republic, which was dedicated to justice and truth. Other agents of subversive magic thinking, such as petty religious traders practicing obscure mystery rites, were likewise banned. Plato's allegiance to rational thought is evident. He opposed irrationalities that threatened societal stability and competed with rational philosophy. Yet, in his laws, Plato allowed the survival of certain epidai, or spells, represented as persuasive verbal or musical discourses intended to cultivate officially approved attitudes among the population. Though rationalized, these epidai were not entirely free of their ancient magical power. Even in the Republic, elements of magic thinking persist, with social implications that cannot be ignored. These elements tend to solidify social groups or classes and reinforce immobility, a tendency that becomes more fully realized in the laws. They appear most clearly in the theory of Mimēsis and in passages describing the functional specialization of individual development toward specific skills or crafts, expressed in terms reminiscent of the magical folk notion, like to like. The like-to-like principle, preserved in ancient proverbs since at least Homer's time, resembles sympathetic magic. Earlier Greek philosophers used it to explain cognition, suggesting that like elements in the sense organs came into contact with like objects to affect perception. For atomists, material particles flowed into the sense organs and were physically grasped by elements of like character. In the Phaedo, phenomenal particulars strive apperceptively to be like the forms, with each striving to be as like as possible to its corresponding equal. This differs from the more systematic technique of collection and division by similarity and difference, expounded in the later dialogues. In early works like the Lysis, Plato is consciously aware of the limitations of this folk theme, like to like. Nevertheless, it underlies his thinking when discussing the classes of the Republic. Here, the like-to-like principle, along with the supposed effects of Mimēsis, acts as a chorus resisting the proposed interchange of children between social classes on a meritocratic basis, explaining the absence of institutional mechanisms to manage such interchanges. The principle of like-to-like suggests that people become what they habitually and repeatedly do, while Mimēsis indicates that they become what they hear and see through a process of spontaneous, yet unavoidable, imitation. The effects of Mimēsis, or artistic representation, are particularly significant for those exposed to it at a young age. According to Plato, the objects of Mimēsis are ontologically inferior, being several steps removed from reality. When a poet represents something, he produces a verbal image not of the form itself, nor of the particular phenomenon corresponding to the form, but merely an imitation of that phenomenon. Consequently, art is an ineffectual guide to truth. Yet psychologically, Mimēsis is highly contagious. Exposure to artistic representations tends to assimilate a person to their emotional tone and intellectual content, and in a suggestible individual, this can translate into actions reflecting what has been seen and heard. In the society of the Republic, people must be protected against this psychological malleability, especially the young, who are most impressionable. They must not be taught that the gods can act unjustly. Primitive myths depicting outrageous behavior among the gods, or of gods toward humans, are to be purged of immoral content. Tales of sons killing fathers or similar acts are prohibited, as such stories would be psychologically disruptive. If poetry is rendered sufficiently aseptic, citizens will not face the difficulty of unlearning harmful lessons in adulthood. Since the gods preside over mating ceremonies in the Republic and are invoked for official blessings, it is crucial that their reputation remain untarnished. Equally important for the security of society is the attitude of its young defenders toward death and the afterlife. Fear of extreme post-mortem punishments, as depicted by imaginative poets, could render them cowards. The intensity of this terror is proportionate to the genius of the poet, creating a need for censorship. Plato, although reluctant, accepts the necessity of excising parts of Homer's poetry. While he admired Homer and asks, through Socrates, for his pardon, Plato judged that Homer's works would be dangerously disruptive to impressionable youth and opposed the philosophical education he wished to cultivate. Damon of Oa, the teacher of Pericles, observed that changes in musical modes in a society accompany changes in laws. The connection between emotive art and social stability is reinforced in the laws, taking cues from the rigidity of Egyptian art and its conservative effects. In the Republic, art like Homer's also produces emotive consequences. Episodes of grief among the sons and kin of the gods, or the gods themselves in unrestrained laughter, must be removed. Similarly, the selfish tears of Achilles are seen as too potent for young Phylax, for if the greatest Greek hero could openly indulge in personal grief, it might encourage similar indulgence among them. Tears and laughter must be excised, along with the heroic image of Achilles, whose individualism has no place in a society governed by reason and balanced seriousness. Plato recognized the contrast between the structure of the heroic personality, volatile, amoebic, and largely self-centered, and the well-organized soul regulated by reason and sophrosyne, which aligns itself with others and the larger community. Homer's heroes are amorphous and uncontrolled. Plato's citizens are insisted and disciplined. Achilles, no matter his greatness, could never fit into the ordered polis of the Republic. Emotionalism was not unique to Achilles or Priam in Homer's poetry. In contemporary Athens, Plato observed that the custom of mourning the dead often undermined psychological balance, making those who engaged in it irrational. To prevent the Phylax from being demoralized by such indulgence in grief, this practice was assigned to the lowest strata of the Republic, whose psychological stability was less critical to the orderly functioning of society. Similarly, tragedians who praised tyrants were unwelcome, as illustrated by Euripides' line that tyrants are wise through friendship with the wise, which Plato criticized. Philosophers, or the sophoi, experienced difficulty in transmitting wisdom to rulers, as Plato had observed in Sicily. The sensitivity of young Phylax to artistic representations and Mimēsis borders on mental fragility. Plato emphasizes that exposure to Homer and other poets could dangerously affect their developing analytical and critical faculties. Young Phylax were seen as potentially slaves to their own senses, unable to resist what they perceived or to restrain themselves from imitating it in action. Although one might expect future philosophers and rulers to be more resilient, their youth renders them pliable, which is excusable. Art, particularly poetry and music, retained a magical element, and Plato recognized the power of such influence. Great poets could affect profound social and psychological consequences. Archilochus' poetry caused ostracism, psychological collapse, and even suicide, whereas Tatius' work helped preserve Sparta during the Messenian War. Consequently, Plato framed provisions in the laws to limit the influence of iambic poets and practitioners of spells. Yet imitation also has a positive aspect. Those sensitive to the emotional influence of art can likewise assimilate what is socially approved and beneficial. Young people can be persuaded to imitate truth and strive to emulate God. Imitation occupies a central role in Plato's thought. Humans can and should align themselves with the nature of divinity. Like the phenomena of the world, humans participate in a permanent reality. Objects contain elements of their forms, and the human soul contains corresponding elements. In the Timaeus, the human soul is composed of the same substances as the souls of the gods, though in a less pure form, with a circular movement encompassing same, other, and being, mirroring the universe's movements on a smaller scale. In the Republic, philosophers or philax are charged with reproducing this divine order within their own souls. Human thought, however, can only imitate reality. It is not identical with it. The God imitated by humans is not given a fully developed personality by Plato. He is not the good, though he must be good. He is not the soul of the universe, yet he is essential and real in some undefined sense. Socrates' references to theos suggest a God who may be personal, but his attributes are unspecified. The God to be imitated is an unknown God, whose lack of defined traits may reflect Plato's caution in describing divinity. Philosophers, in aligning themselves with the divine order, practice what can be called imitation of God. The gods invoked in civic ceremonies, such as marriages of philax, are not necessarily the same as the God of imitation, but they retain importance as social regulators. Their influence is evident in laws where denial of these gods carries severe consequences. The God of philosophers is mysterious, and philax may act as a guiding caste, encouraging other citizens to imitate the more comprehensible divine concepts represented by the city's gods. Human nature, in both rulers and the populace, was considered pliable and suggestible, allowing imitation of the divine to produce socially beneficial results. Psychological ductility plays a central role in shaping the social structure of the Republic. Both young and old are imprinted in thought and behavior by the actions they are trained to perform and by the habits of daily life. When these actions and habits are narrowly defined, those trained in them are likely to develop a rigid outlook. Heraclitus regarded ethos, or customary character, as divine, ethos anthropoi daimon, and it is closely connected with habit, or ethos. In its earliest sense, ethos signifies the habitual haunt of an animal, the place where it is expected to appear. Plato's intense concern with habituation is illustrated by a story in which he criticized a man for playing dice. The man excused himself, saying he was playing for trifling stakes, and Plato responded, "There is nothing trifling about the habit." This exchange highlights the importance Plato placed on ethos in forming the ethos of the young, ensuring they are habituated in socially desirable patterns of behavior. Even in maturity, bad habits can cling to the psyche, which is thought capable of carrying acquired depravity into the next world. The soul, according to Plato, bears the imprint of its paideia and trophy, and nothing else. If education has been vicious or ineffective, producing bad habits, the consequences may be enduring. Control over habituation is therefore crucial. From early youth, the philax are bound to act only in ways appropriate for their role. Their behaviors must remain within the proper limits of governing functions. They must not be exposed to the corrupting influences of theatrical or other artistic Mimēsis, nor to the broad, irrational forces of democracy, which would easily overwhelm them. Plato maintained that moral evil, evil of the soul, is the most infectious and destructive. Unlike the Sabatians, who believed that exposure to moral evil could teach control, Plato held that young philax, lacking any homoeopath within themselves, would be highly vulnerable to such influences. Association with moral evil was far more dangerous than contact with bodily disease, and attempts to cure it with more evil were counterproductive. Controlled habituation could, in Plato's view, safeguard individuals and society from these assimilative dangers. All social groups and classes were to be habituated according to their respective and specialized roles. The defenders of the Republic were to be thoroughly instilled with the color of the laws. Even the lowest class had to understand and embrace its functions fully. Good habits were intended to prevent the absorption of bad habits, and the most effective method to achieve this was early and consistent training. Plato assumed that children would learn their father's trades in line with customary Athenian practice, though in reality such children were not barred from pursuing other paths or participating politically. In the Republic, however, these craftsmen's lives were to remain constrained, not merely by the political dominance of the philax, but by a narrow universe of behavior suitable to their role. To the universe of behavior corresponds a suitably limited mental universe. In the Republic, it is considered wrong for a carpenter to switch tools with a cobbler and attempt the cobbler's work, and it is equally wrong for any practitioner of a manual craft to attempt the governing functions of the phylax. Each is to focus exclusively on their respective trade. Unlike craftsmen in Athenian democracy, they are not imagined as taking an interest, intellectual or otherwise, in political matters. They are masters of limited manual techniques, capable only of thinking about the mechanical concerns of their craft. They are not to develop any capacity for governance. The narrowness of the craftsman's mental universe is illustrated by the opposition to the idea that, for example, potters should participate in feasting. Such activity is deemed absurd, for the extravagant and intellectual flights of feasts depicted in the symposium are foreign to their work. Feasting is irrelevant to pottery, and all the potter's energy must be devoted to creating pots. It is even suggested that a properly trained and skilled craftsman might not feel the need to be ill. This division of functions in society reflects the ancient like-to-like theme. The potter becomes so behaviorally and mentally assimilated to the repetitive experiences of his narrow universe that he cannot even participate fully in a festive dinner. Potters grow increasingly like potters, cobblers like cobblers. The children of each class inherit and perpetuate these specialized qualities. Like nature is meant to mate with like, producing offspring that encapsulate the characteristics of their parents. This mirrors the likeness of craftsmen to their craft and, when applied to the phylax, ensures continuity of phylax-like generations. Some intensification of likeness is imagined, as successive generations resemble each other, whereas in other works, such as the Politicus and Laws, unlike individuals are recommended to mate to prevent extremes. Plato also notes that extreme qualities tend to provoke their opposites. An overabundance of phylax quality in an individual could lead to degeneration, and poor marital selection among phylax could threaten the stability of society. The likeness theme recurs in the Laws, where the conditioning of children to their future roles is discussed. Ordinary, unreflective individuals are encouraged to become amenable citizens not only through rational instruction, but also through the persuasive influence of music and choirs. If this fails, physical coercion is applied. Those who cannot respond to music are disciplined by the drill sergeant's commands. Development in the Republic is shaped by sensitivity to what is seen and heard, a tendency to imitate, and a gradual assimilation into behavioral homogeneity. Whether a child is destined to be a phylax or a member of a craft group, training begins early in the father's profession. The individual grows within the constraints of this training environment, and mental development is molded by habituation to behaviors suited to social role. The consistency of craftsmen's lives and their narrow purposes shapes their children, while the broader, yet still limited, environment of the phylax group shapes the youth of various age groups within the phylax community. The strong formative powers within each group work against the idea that individuals can easily change their social class. They make the advancement of a gifted individual to the class of phylax extremely difficult, if it is even possible, and the demotion of unintelligent children of phylax is not easy, though it is somewhat less obstructed than upward mobility. Children of craftsmen, trained from early years in the limiting and mechanical procedures of their fathers' trades, are likely to acquire the vulgarity and dullness that Plato attributes to such people. Only the most energetic and exceptional individual could reveal phylax character under these circumstances. As a result, much material suitable for promotion to the phylax class may remain dormant, spent in lives of mechanical monotony, which threatens the long-term security of the Republic that depends on maintaining an adequate number of phylax. The improbability of a potter's or peasant's child being promoted is reinforced by the early start in educational training, particularly through play. Phylax children are habituated from early life to the circumstances of the ruling group, while the children of craftsmen learn practical lessons that increasingly distance them from promotion. Beyond the dulling effect of mechanical labor, the personality structure of craftsmen's children will differ sharply from that of phylax children. The former are likely products of patriarchal families, closely linked to family routines and relationships. Phylax children, by contrast, are raised within accurately observed peer groups, cared for temporarily by nurses, and address certain adults in designated age groups as mother or father, without intimate knowledge of their biological parents or a profound familial bond. In essence, they resemble intellectualized young Spartans, whereas craftsmen's children are more like helots or metics. The phylax is a child of society. The others are merely children of their parents. The absence of institutional mechanisms to detect exceptional individuals outside the phylax class is notable, given the malleable character of humans and their ready assimilation to habits and experiences. Although the Republic is more poetic than procedural, one might expect some method for identifying and promoting such individuals. Demotion of unsuitable phylax may require less ingenuity. Where the classifications by metal are introduced, there is an explicit statement that children should be promoted or demoted according to their qualities rather than their parentage. Gold or silver offspring of a bronze parent are placed according to their abilities, and conversely, the bronze child of gold or silver parents is relegated to the third class. Plato appears aware of the difficulty in creating an institutional method to convince the first generation of phylax to accept this metal myth, though the younger generation will not pose the same challenge. Yet no effective means are outlined to persuade the elders. Although the problem of institutional mechanisms for operating the society is not fully resolved, it is clear that Plato has considered it. His omission of detailed solutions may reflect acute awareness of the issue, prompting him to defer it rather than ignore it. Some pages after the discussion of the metal classification, there appears a passage that has been interpreted as sharply limiting the possibility of interchange between classes. This passage has been examined in relation to the self-concentrating and specialist character of craft occupations, and it is clear that it forbids a craftsman from acting as if he were a phylax or concerning himself with matters outside the narrow scope of his craft. Some scholars have argued that this passage entirely negates the promotion or demotion mentioned earlier. Others, however, note that the passage only opposes the elevation of an unworthy craftsman, one who, through acquisitiveness, has become excessively rich and arrogant, to the class of phylax. Later passages in the Republic reaffirm the possibility of promotion for the worthy and demotion for the inferior, and the recapitulation in the Mimēsis supports the mobility of individuals between classes. Yet, if assimilative and repetitive behavior affects individuals as seems likely, such craftsmen will soon solidify, and be far beyond the possibility of changing their characters to meet the demands of a higher social group. Their ways will become firmly set. Habituation will have rendered them unfit to rule in the society of the Republic. Consequently, it may be less relevant to pit these finished products of a system of habituation against the notion that class interchange is possible. If such interchange is to occur, it must take place earlier in an individual's development. The central difficulty is how to identify young individuals whose responsiveness to their environment is so thorough, for promotion or demotion. How can they resist a powerful environment with which they increasingly blend due to imitative tendencies and fixed habits? Considering the strong force of assimilative experience and group conditioning, the answer seems to be that they cannot resist it. A talented individual born into the third class will likely remain in it, despite his abilities. However, this was clearly not Plato's intention. There must remain some remote possibility of discerning a potential phylax among the early potters and cobblers. Such an individual may display less malleability than his peers and respond differently to his play training. The selection of the initial foundational group of phylax is carried out through graded tests applied from childhood, assessing their reactions to pleasures and fears. Those who succeed become rulers and phylax, some destined for semi-divine honors after death. It is possible that similar tests were intended for selecting candidates in subsequent generations, providing a method by which Platonic meritocracy allows the lowly to rise. The passage suggesting this occurs just before the introduction of the metal myth and foreshadows it in describing the phylax as to be assayed like gold. The contradiction remains. Plato desired mobility of talent within society, yet the assimilative tendencies present in his system work against it. These tendencies obstruct his aim of a just allocation of individuals among the groups of the Republic. People become what they do, and they become what they perceive. As a result, they are liable to remain fixed in the group into which they were born. This quasi-magical assimilation of the individual to his experiences and habits is not absolutely rigid, nor is it systematically enforced by Plato. These are tendencies rather than laws. It is likely that a few individuals may be selected from the lower classes and elevated to the phylax group, but the process is hindered by the factors discussed earlier. The strong probability is that most individuals will remain in the class of their birth, even if their talents equal those of the phylax. Only the most outstanding could successfully resist the pull of such a powerful environment. This chapter considers how an individual's life was shaped by an irresistible force of ancient origin. This force was known as Eros, the daimon of sexual and procreative instincts, regarded as both good and evil, a source of creation and destruction on a universal scale. Plato was highly aware of this power and held deep respect for its influence. He recognized that if it were left unchecked, it could devastate both society and the individual with overwhelming and frenzied strength. His aim was to harness it, directing its force so that it might benefit the individual by turning love toward wisdom and the pursuit of wisdom. In this way, it could also serve society by cultivating thoughtful citizens and ensuring the continuation of the community. To understand the impact of this daimon on society, the individual, and Plato himself, it is necessary to begin with his view of Eros as a primal creative force. This ancient and original presence appeared at the center of cosmogonic myths. In the Symposium, Eros is described in Socrates' speech as the child of Poros and Penia, the former representing supply and the latter representing need. Poros has been likened to the notion of primeval chaos, the container of all undifferentiated things at the beginning of the world. Their union is expressed through the vivid imagery of myth. In the Critias, another cosmogonic account with a sexual theme tells of the creation of the island of Atlantis, a prototype of the sea-power city-state, which Plato viewed as unstable and inherently unjust. Poseidon fathered its people by uniting with the daughter of mortals native to the land, Cleito. From their union came the inhabitants of Atlantis, until its destruction in conflict with an ancient Athens that had not yet been weakened by democracy or the disorder of the seafaring multitude. It fits with Plato's disdain for naval power and maritime trade that a city destined for ruin should originate from a god's desire for a mortal woman, a divine tale of passion that would never have been permitted in the orderly society imagined in the Republic. Woman, like the earth itself, is a source of life. In the Mimēsis, it is said that woman imitates the earth in giving life, for the earth does not imitate woman. The Cratylus reinforces this awareness by linking names and meanings, connecting woman with birth and earth with being born. Both are understood as givers of life. Yet the ancient creative force within both woman and earth is also harsh and oppressive. Its effects on the individual are vividly shown in the story found in the first book of the Republic. There, Sophocles, when questioned in old age about whether he was still capable of relations with women, replied that he was not, and felt grateful. To him, the end of this power was a liberation from a wild and tyrannical master. The calm and balanced temperament that Sophocles displayed, which Plato admired, was not easily attained. In the writings of Plato, Eros is often linked with words that suggest physical pain, desire, and violent disturbance of the mind. This reveals that, like many of his fellow Greeks, Plato could see love as a kind of sickness. The destructive power of Eros is portrayed vividly in the Symposium, where Aristophanes tells his story of the primeval human. These early beings were spherical in form, with double sets of limbs and a single head joined together. Their nature was to mate with the earth rather than with other creatures, and in their arrogance they grew dangerous in the sight of Zeus. Their pride and lack of restraint made them a threat even to the gods. Yet, unlike the Titans who were destroyed outright for their defiance, these beings were spared, for the gods feared that their total destruction would put an end to the sacrifices and honors given to them. Instead, Zeus, in measured anger, split them into two. From that moment, what we now see as individuals are not truly whole, but are sorrowful halves, endlessly searching for their missing part, whether male or female. This myth is not a direct expression of Plato's own thought, nor entirely Aristophanes' either, but it reflects the kind of tale a poet of Aristophanes' brilliance might tell at a banquet. Still, beneath its comic exaggeration lies genuine insight, for it undoes the painful essence of love. Love is shown as the mark of incompleteness and unhappiness, and in this way, longing and suffering become inseparable from desire. Plato himself saw that intense love was bound to unhappiness. For him, a deeply sexual person could never possess a calm and balanced soul. In the Republic, the figure of the tyrannical man illustrates what happens when Eros runs unchecked. His unrepressed dreams reveal forbidden desires, even the wish for union with his own mother. During his travels in Sicily, Plato was appalled by the unrestrained lust of the people, who seemed unable to sleep without a partner. Already in the Symposium, through the character of Alcibiades, Plato had portrayed the dangerous charm of a man overflowing with erotic force. Readers of the time would have known Alcibiades well, both for his dazzling attraction and his notorious political career, shifting from feigned democracy to outright Spartan loyalties. The Republic itself notes how close the Democrat stands to the tyrant, for both are consumed by their need to fulfill every inner desire and to win over the crowd. Alcibiades was clearly one of these men, though in the Symposium the emphasis falls more on his beauty, brilliance, and ruinous charm than on his political life. Surrounded by admirers, he even counted Socrates among them, or so he claimed. Yet the love Socrates offered was not the common, physical sort, but the higher kind, seeking to lead the beloved toward truth and goodness. Alcibiades recalls, with comic honesty, his failed attempt to seduce Socrates, who remained unmoved by his advances. The significance of this lies in Socrates' strength of soul. His resistance to Alcibiades was not only part of his role as midwife to wisdom and knowledge, but also a testament to his inner integrity. Stories told about him show a man able to endure physical hardship and face fear without wavering. In the Phaedrus, it is said that those overtaken by Eros suffer a kind of disintegration of the soul. When their beloved resists their demands, they seek to break down the other's character, weakening it until their own satisfaction can be met. In the case of an older lover with a younger beloved, if the older man succeeds in reducing the younger into pliant weakness, he himself becomes diminished. By surrounding himself with the weak, he continues to love only what is base. Both lover and beloved are thus corrupted, and in this way Eros, when left unmastered, brings destruction to all it touches. Sensual pleasure acts like a nail fastening the soul more firmly to the body, burdening it with the body's flaws. The careless indulgence in physical Eros, the common form tied to desire of the senses, leads only to disaster for the soul. It is for this reason that Corinthian courtesans, famed for their beauty, skill, and greed, are strictly excluded from the ideal city of the Republic. Their influence, like other luxuries such as fine food and elaborate clothing, would corrupt the balanced and rational nature of the guardians. In the laws, too, random and unlawful passion is forbidden, and citizens are urged to value beautiful souls above fair bodies. From his earliest works to his later writings, Plato remained consistent. Human beings must be taught to desire what is truly good, not merely what is pleasurable. Only then can the vital force of Eros be tamed and directed toward truth, wisdom, and the service of a just and stable society. This higher Eros belongs to the soul and not to the senses. It is the heavenly Eros, distinct from the common. In the Symposium, this Eros is not destructive, but becomes the very inspiration for the search for truth. It has no connection with physical gratification. Socrates even remarks that pleasant as it would be if wisdom could be transmitted by touch, such is not the case. Instead, this Eros is a refined and spiritual means of appreciation, leading those moved by it through successive stages of enlightenment until they reach a recognition akin to the initiation into sacred mysteries. Socrates credits this teaching to the priestess Diotima, though it likely reflects Plato's own conviction. The spiritually erotic man seeks the immortal, the eternal truths and beauty, while the man of sensual desire clings only to the transient, bodily, and unreasoned. A lover would therefore do far better to educate his beloved than to waste time on fleeting pleasures. Eros must be grounded in reason, given a permanent and noble aim. In this way, it becomes philosophical. For Plato, this transformation allows a dangerous psychic power to be sublimated into a constructive force, both useful to the individual and beneficial to society. The masculine focus of this philosophical Eros is not surprising, given the distinctly Athenian setting of the symposium. In 5th and 4th century Athens, women held narrow and domestic roles. It was unlikely that an erotic attraction directed toward a woman could be elevated into a path of knowledge and love of wisdom. Only the courtesans, who possessed more freedom than respectable women, had any chance to inspire such intellectual affection, and even among them this was rare. Respectable women were confined to the household and entirely dependent on men. Yet in the societies imagined in the Republic and the laws, women appear in a far more active and important role. In the Republic, they are granted equality with men, while in the laws they enjoy rights surpassing those of any contemporary Greek city. In both visions, women take part in governing. In the Republic, their share in ruling is set as equal to that of men of their class, while in the laws they are entrusted especially with the oversight of marriage and children. Still, in both works, this equality is limited. In the Republic, it applies only to the guardian women, and in the laws only to full citizen women. Even so, the guardian women of the Republic live under strict regulation, just like their male counterparts. They are paired with chosen men for short-term unions, the sole purpose of which is to produce new citizens of acceptable lineage. When a child is born, it is quickly placed in the care of state nurses who raise it alongside others of the same class and age. The mother then returns to her duties as guardian, until she is once again assigned another temporary union. In the society imagined by Plato, the guardians were subject to strict regulations regarding marriage. The best were to be paired with the best as often as possible, while the worst were to mate with the worst as rarely as possible. In the laws, which presents a less extreme and less poetic vision than the Republic, the natural tendency of like to seek like was deliberately discouraged. The purpose was to balance genetic inheritance and, by extension, maintain political balance within the city. Here, marriages were permanent, based upon economic arrangements such as the division of land, rather than upon eugenic principles as in the Republic. For the lower classes in the Republic, Plato appears to have left marriage customs largely untouched, resembling ordinary Greek practice. He showed little interest in legislating in detail for their lives, particularly in economic matters. In every case, marriage was seen as serving a social purpose rather than as a means of pleasure. The question of sexual indulgence is addressed with caution. In the Republic, the hedonistic motive is firmly rejected, though it occasionally slips in at the margins. Later, Plato acknowledged that sexual relations, in moderation, might be beneficial for health. He warned of the ill effects of total abstinence, and in the laws he considered health again when proposing arrangements for the remarriage of widows. In both sexual matters and the use of wine, the old were granted more freedom than the young. But for those of age to procreate, strict care was taken to prevent random relationships. Plato's approach in these regulations reflects less a spirit of Puritanism than an absence of hedonism. The arrangement of temporary marriages among the guardians in the Republic raised practical difficulties. There was the problem of preventing accidental incest, as well as the challenge of making such an institution psychologically convincing. Partners for these unions were chosen through a lottery, secretly manipulated by the ruling guardians in accordance with hidden eugenic calculations. To prevent resentment among those considered of little value for breeding, it was important to disguise these decisions as the workings of chance rather than of deliberate policy. Ceremonies with dancing, music, and prayer provided a social and religious framework that distracted attention from the hidden process of selection. Yet Plato's motives in proposing these rituals were not entirely manipulative, for he retained a genuine belief in the power of ceremonial practice. Still, the danger remained that the lottery might fail to deceive. Guardians who repeatedly found themselves excluded might suspect trickery. Those trained in analysis and inquiry, as they were, could hardly remain blind forever. It seems unlikely that all would remain persuaded by ceremonies in which many of them would participate only as spectators. In this way, the falsified lottery risked underestimating the intelligence of the very group it sought to control. It might even lead to the emergence of a faction of dissatisfied guardians, hostile to the ruling order. One possible means of easing this discontent would be to allow occasional marriages for those of lower eugenic value. Indeed, the rule that the worst should mate with the worst as seldom as possible already implies that such unions did occur, though infrequently. This suggests that the inferior guardians were not condemned to permanent celibacy. Furthermore, the restrictions placed upon their children ensured that their numbers would never grow quickly enough to threaten the balance of society. There remains the question of how the secrecy of the lottery and its guiding marriage number could be concealed within the class of phylax. It might be possible for the inner circle of rulers to keep the secret from the lowest class, but it is far harder to imagine how they could deceive the relatively small group of their intellectual equals, that is, the entire body of phylax, not merely the inferior ones. This difficulty is heightened by the fact that the inner group would, from time to time, be required to draw new members from the most worthy among the phylax themselves, making it inevitable that the existence of a secret, or at least the rumor of one, would become known. The laws of marriage in the Republic deny the phylax, as well as the group closely related to them, the epikouroi, any real personal choice. These warriors can be regarded as younger phylax, the future archontes, engaged in defense of the city. As for the so-called third class of the Republic, it cannot be assumed that they freely chose partners in a romantic sense. Although choice in love is never entirely free, being shaped by hidden forces and influences, those who believe they can freely select their partners are, in practice, free to do so. This freedom does not exist for the phylax, whose partners are determined by the chances of the lottery, though they are made to suppose otherwise. Those who have passed the age of procreation, however, clearly enjoy a different position. They are permitted to take companions of their own, choosing among others of their rank, limited only by the rule that men must avoid women of childbearing age or those still counted within the age groups of their earlier unions. Likewise, those below the age of procreation appear to be free in their choices. In stories, freedom of choice in love is often depicted. The fall of Troy, for example, was caused by Helen and Paris choosing one another, despite the influence of deities that drove them to it. In this sense, when one is overpowered by desire, the act is still considered a kind of choice, since it is not fixed by law or social order. Greeks, after all, frequently fell in love without regard for eugenic, philosophical, or civic reasons. The third class of the Republic, however, is described as being moved primarily by acquisitiveness. They resemble neither the land-bound serfs of Sparta nor a powerless proletariat, but rather a class of traders and farmers comparable to free Athenians. They are excluded from rule, yet they are not fixed to the soil, and in this respect they resemble more a middle class than a dependent population, since their lives revolve around commerce and gain. They are not unlike the energetic and ambitious citizen body of Athens, reduced to a scale that Plato found acceptable. From this perspective, it seems reasonable to assume that their marriages were based on property, much like those of the citizen class in the laws. Young citizens there are urged to select wives from families not wealthier than their own, but otherwise suitable, so as to create balanced unions for the good of society. This arrangement likely reflects what might be expected among the third class of the Republic, even though the citizens of the laws are tied to agriculture and forbidden to engage in crafts. The virtue expected to restrain the acquisitiveness and competitiveness of the third class of the Republic is wise moderation, and here too there is a parallel with the citizens of the laws. Nothing suggests that wealth was evenly spread among the third class of the Republic, and so moderation would be all the more necessary, for even in crafts a wealthy artisan was not always regarded as the best artisan. It is therefore plausible to suppose that marriages within this class were stable and permanent, resembling those of Athens in the 5th or 4th century, grounded in property, family influence, and, to some extent, personal preference. If this represents Plato's view, then the marriages of the third class were not shaped by strict institutional rules, but by customary limitations on passion, similar to Athenian traditions. Love, seen as a powerful affliction, could fall upon any member of any class, but each was expected to endure it in accordance with the customs of their rank. A phylax was expected to overcome it, since personal happiness was not considered part of the approved purpose of their life. The lower classes were not held to such high demands. Yet in every case, the path of passion was obstructed. The women belonging to the lowest social class of the Republic can likely be regarded as sharing the traditional ignorance and timidity of Athenian women. They lived withdrawn and dependent lives, their role confined to bearing children and managing the household. Their tasks did not require them to be much more capable than the slaves whose work they oversaw. Slaves are not directly mentioned as part of the Republic, yet it is not unreasonable to suppose that some wealthier members of the third class might have possessed them. The famous remark that the greatest glory of women was to be spoken of as little as possible, whether for good or ill, would apply in large part to these women of the third class. Little of note is said about them. Nothing specific is mentioned about their education, though it is likely that some provision existed for it, especially since the more traditional society of the laws decrees that both boys and girls must receive education. In contrast, the women of the phylax are presented differently. By means of an animal analogy, it is argued that they should be given the same education as the men and be prepared to take on equal responsibilities. The analogy of the watchdog is most fitting for the phylax, who protect rather than are protected, unlike the lower classes, which resemble passive flocks rather than vigilant hounds. In discussions of eugenics, this animal analogy shows its poetic quality, shaping and even distorting the argument it is intended to support. Plato does not consistently use natural comparisons between human society and the lives of animals. Rather, the analogy serves as a secondary support for views already formed. Active and intelligent groups are compared to active and intelligent creatures, while passive groups are likened to passive ones. The aim is mainly to persuade, yet the imagery often rises to the level of poetry. Accounts of the women of the phylax likely drew from many sources. Tales were told of distant peoples where women lived as equals to men, joined them in war, and even practiced communal sharing of wives. Such stories became more common as Athenians gained wider contact with other cultures through trade and empire. Legends of the Amazons and other tribes offered striking examples of alternative social systems. Closer to Athens, Sparta displayed its own form of sex equality, which, though open to dispute in its results, was remarkable nonetheless. Tragedy also gave voice to powerful female figures, as in the story of Medea, who took terrible vengeance on Jason after he dismissed her claims as a human being and cast her aside. She suffered the fate of many women, both Athenian and foreign wives, who could be discarded without remorse, but unlike them, she had not been hardened from youth to accept such treatment. The turmoil of the Peloponnesian War further suggested to comic poets that women, because of their peaceful nature and desire for harmony, might prove more capable than men in managing political and international matters. This notion shapes plays such as the Thesmophoria Zeusi and the Ecclesia Zeusi, and may well have influenced the Republic. In Plato's time, ideas of this kind were common, forming an atmosphere from which any writer might draw, consciously or unconsciously, when imagining an ideal society. Even non-human creatures were sometimes imagined as having a social order superior to that of mankind, as seen in comic works where animals or birds were shown to live in harmony with nature, free from the corrupting institutions invented by man. It is not only the women of the lowest class who remain vague and undefined in the Republic. The women of the phylates themselves are not described in detail or in a fully satisfactory way. Still, certain qualities are assigned to them, and some outlines of the social framework in which they are expected to live can be discerned. Since they are to have a succession of short-term marriages, each arranged for the purposes of the state, it is essential that they possess an independent sense of individuality rather than the dependent character of the traditional Greek woman. Any personal attachments they may feel toward men of their group must be suppressed for the sake of eugenic aims, unless, by chance, affection and eugenic necessity coincide. Their emotional ties will not be concentrated within a small household, but will instead extend broadly to the community of their fellow phylates. The many individuals they call brothers, sisters, fathers, or mothers will strengthen their sense of belonging to the group as a whole. Like the aristocratic women of Rome's later republic, their marriages will be motivated by social or political purposes, and in Plato's ideal city, political purposes are also philosophical ones. Because their marriages lack a domestic foundation, women of this class will have to develop inner philosophical strength to sustain themselves as individuals. Marriage ceremonies will be celebrated, and occasions arranged for physical union, yet there is no indication that couples will live together beyond these events. Their lives will remain within communal dwellings and common meals, a system inspired by Sparta, but later regarded as impractical even by Plato himself. Although the sexual lives of these women are strictly limited to fulfill the state's eugenic needs and to replenish those lost through war or natural causes, their characters can be suggested by comparison to another type of woman, one who in theory enjoyed sexual freedom, the hetaira. More specifically, the literary image of Aspasia provides an illuminating parallel. In the dialogue that portrays her, she appears as a commanding and intellectually gifted figure, almost masculine in authority, and even Socrates is depicted as somewhat wary of her. It is said, perhaps with irony, that she inspired or even composed the famous funeral speech delivered by Pericles, and her talents and influence were well known in Athens. While it may be an exaggeration to claim that she instigated wars, the portrait of her suggests she was capable of such influence. It would be misleading to argue that the hetaira became the hidden model for the women of the phylates, but the striking figure of Aspasia demonstrates how such women could be imagined as possessing intellect, force of character, and influence. Even if she embodied democratic ideals that Plato distrusted, her intelligence is unmistakably acknowledged. In this way, her image helps to fill the otherwise shadowy outlines of the female rulers of the Republic. Another side of the women of the phylates, gentler and more refined, is reflected in the figure of the priestess Diotima from the Symposium. She does not represent a ruler in the sense of possessing strength of will or the temperament of a king, but rather as a spiritual guide in the mysteries of a higher form of love, one that is directed toward truth, knowledge, and immortality. Her profound sense of philosophical piety suggests the type of prayers that priests and priestesses in the Republic might be expected to offer during the celebrations of temporary marriages, so that the children born from them might bring good fortune to the city. If the priests and priestesses are themselves members of the guardian class, their prayers may have been imagined as similar in spirit to Diotima's account of love. Yet it is just as likely that Plato was thinking of ordinary ritual prayers known in Greek tradition, and thus these two elements, Diotima's lofty teaching and the practical details of civic ritual, do not entirely fit together except in the realm of ideals. Still, the portrait of Diotima presents a striking image of a woman philosopher who, within the dialogue, takes the place of Socrates himself and instructs him in the theory of love, just as Aspasia is portrayed as teaching him about politics in another dialogue. These female figures are not simply foils for Socrates to refute. They dominate, they command, and they embody forms of female greatness that can easily be imagined as rulers in the Republic. They allow the reader to grasp the possibility of the woman guardian as more than an abstract conception. Like the heroines in modern drama, who are unmistakably female without being defined primarily by sexuality, They show strength of intellect and character rather than mere domestic roles. Critics have objected that such ruling women appear unfeminine, more like men deprived of their sex, resembling ancient statues that fused male and female qualities yet appeared predominantly male with added feminine traits. Plato's reasoning, however, is that the soul itself is without sex and capable of inhabiting either a male or female body, while at the same time the continuation of the race must be secured through reproduction. The comparison to a hermaphroditic nature is not without meaning, though the assumption that women must remain traditionally feminine is debatable. The image of the hermaphrodite became increasingly popular in art from the late 5th century onward, both as a technical challenge and as an expression of myths that told of transformations between sexes. Figures such as Tiresias, Caeneus, Iphis, and others were said to have undergone such changes, while the story of Hermaphroditus, united with the nymph Solmochus, became the most famous example of this blending of identities. The fusion was seen as a symbolic form of sexual union, and certain marriage customs reflected a similar interchange, sometimes involving the exchange of clothing between bride and groom or rituals that emphasized symbolic inversion of sexual roles. In Sparta, for instance, the bride wore men's clothing, and in Argos women once dressed as men and even wore false beards during a festival. The theme also appears in myth and philosophy. In the Symposium, Aristophanes describes the original human beings as round, double creatures of three kinds: male, female, and a third androgynous type. After being split, the halves longed for their missing parts, with male halves seeking males, female halves seeking females, and male-female pairs seeking one another. This imaginative account reflects the same fascination with the blending of the sexes. Other sources even mention a male form of the goddess of love, bearing a masculine name, further illustrating how deeply this theme of duality and fusion permeated ancient thought. The idea of sexual transformation fits well with Plato's vision of equality between the sexes, which may be understood as a deliberate and intellectual extension of this theme. Yet, just as with the old customs of exchanging clothing, there is little consistency in Plato's treatment of women when it comes to intellectual and social equality. Even while praising the exceptional intellectual abilities of certain women in the Republic, he still points out what he sees as their general physical weakness compared with men. Elsewhere in his writings, he often makes disparaging remarks about the natural capacities of women, despite the fact that it is precisely their natural qualities which qualify them for rule in the Republic. At times he groups women with children, slaves, and the simple-minded as natural inferiors. In his myths of rebirth, the souls of degenerate men are said to be born again as women, and if they continue to fail in improvement, they eventually descend into animal forms. Such comments show how easily Plato could slip into popular assumptions about women and slaves. At certain moments he goes even further, allowing his characters in the Republic to propose that women should serve as sensual rewards for warriors who distinguish themselves in the defense of the city. In this passage, Glaucon suggests that victorious fighters should have a recognized and legal right to embrace anyone they desire, whether male or female. The word used in the text seems to mean to kiss, but its context strongly implies a broader sense of complete sexual possession. Where women are concerned, this is explicitly tied to the aim of increasing the number of children born from noble fathers, recalling the manipulated marriage arrangements designed to give successful men privileged access to women, so that as many children as possible might be produced. Thus the term cannot be understood as mere affection, but as full sexual rights. For men who might be chosen as rewards, this too would suggest something more than the noble and restrained expressions of affection allowed between father and son. In this case, the text clearly points toward the common form of love that finds its fulfillment in the physical union of men and women, or of men and boys, rather than the lofty spiritual love celebrated in the Symposium. It is not convincing to dismiss these suggestions as nothing more than Glaucon's humor or light-hearted characterization, for Socrates accepts them, even if only briefly, and Socrates here speaks with Plato's voice. Nor can the passage be explained away by comparison to modern displays of affection toward returning soldiers, since in the ancient text the warriors are given a legal and eugenic right to sexual rewards, which has no parallel in such spontaneous modern gestures. The resemblance lies only in atmosphere, not in meaning, and the substance of Plato's words remains. In these passages we see what might be called an anti-Plato, where the philosopher forgets his own warning that pleasure lies close to excess, and allows his zeal to overtake the consistency of his social design. His treatment of defective children elsewhere also shows how his humaneness and consistency could be momentarily overwhelmed by his enthusiasm. Yet overall, Plato's intention is clear. He sought to make the women of the guardian class independent and as free as possible, not objects of desire but subjects in their own right. That they should resemble men in temperament is not surprising and need not be considered a flaw. The position he imagined for these women was a major advance over earlier views of their place in society, standing in stark contrast to the subservience he still accepted for the lowest class of women. Though his harsh or morally questionable ideas should not be ignored, the role he granted to the female guardians marks real progress, and can be seen as anticipating later efforts to achieve a rational balance of rights between the sexes.